Prison-like, desolate, bleak. Barbed wire and guard towers bordered the internment camps, which operated like bustling little towns on their own. There were schools, hospitals, theaters, shops, and mess halls. Barracks, which were small, tight living quarters, were assigned to usually 4 or 5 families. There was little to no privacy, and they lacked cooking and plumbing facilities. Food was often served in mess halls. And life would persist like that for Japanese Americans, against their own will. You see, after Japanese air forces attacked the U.S. naval base of Pearl Harbor in December 1941, President of the time, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, signed Executive Order 9066. This resulted in the mass exodus of Japanese Americans from their homes and into internment camps. The most outright act of human violation was committed. Their livelihood had been compromised to appease the fear of those in white America. Anyone of Japanese descent living in America at the time were suspected of being spies for the homeland, committing treason. So sectioned off from the rest of the world, they were placed into one of the 10 internment camps located across the country. This compromise only led to social conflicts and strengthened the gap between the Japanese and the rest of America. In this case, compromise could not be achieved because agreeing would be allowing the compromise of their own liberty, of their own freedom, a right the Constitution had guaranteed to all people. But 3 court cases in particular pulled out the meaning of equality. They argued the constitutionality of Japanese internment, and if it was really legal to hold back innocent people under no legitimate basis. But once Order 9066 was put into effect, thousands had to prepare. To be transferred to the camps, they had to sell all of their settlements, such as their homes and their shops. They had to give up their old life. With only what they could carry and the clothes on their backs, they reported to assembly centers, where from there, they'd wait. Stables acted like temporary housing for thousands of men, women, and children that waited, and it'd be for weeks or for months even. From there, Japanese families had to settle in barracks and small settlements. They had to readjust to this new way of life. What the government gave them was only a fraction of the world they wanted. Yes, the camps acted like a world of their own, but the world outside of those camps were laced with racism and injustice, masked as fear. And it did not get better from there. The government had published articles dismissing any claims of horrible treatment of the Japanese in the camps. They had released media making the camps seem better than they actually were, through rose-colored lenses. But not everything was good as it seemed, and so many had to give up their lives they had set out in America due to the fear of treason. The first court case that argued against the constitutionality of Japanese internment was Hirabayashi versus U.S. To officially follow Order 9066, rigid curfew regulations were put into place. Violators were to be penalized. But initially being confident in the law protecting his rights, Gordon Hirabayashi refused to follow the curfew place. He continued as usual, a law-abiding citizen. But according to Densho, when it came to register for relocation, he instead turned himself into the FBI with the intention of creating a test case for the government's right to incarcerate Japanese Americans without due process of law. Gordon Hirabayashi believed that the government would protect them. Surely they would, but they did not protect him. The FBI soon found evidence of his decision to violate curfew and the evacuation order. Violating curfew and refusing the exclusion order meant violating public law. The court concluded that his actions were a federal crime. Hirabayashi pled not guilty on the basis that the exclusion order was discriminatory and unconstitutional. However, the court propounded their dissenting opinion. In the end, he was placed in a road camp for violating both curfew and the exclusion order, and the constitutionality of the camps was never discussed.
Well, it was disappointing. I think we have to admit that. It was disappointing, and for a while I thought the Constitution failed me. Then it occurred to me that it wasn't necessarily the Constitution that failed me, it was the people who were placed in the responsibility of upholding the Constitution.
The second court case involves Fred Korematsu. Like Hirabayashi, he broke curfew. He didn't report to the Assembly Center, where from there, internees would be transitioning into their camps. Instead, he stayed behind with his Italian-American girlfriend. In an attempt to disguise his racial identity, he changed his name and had minor plastic surgery on his eyes to appear European-American. He went under the name Clyde Serra, claiming to be of Hawaiian and Spanish descent, but was soon arrested after finding his true identity. He was put on a 5-year probation and sent to an assembly center in San Bruno, California. However, he held onto his convictions. He appealed the case all the way to the Supreme Court, arguing that Executive Order 966 was discriminatory and went against all the freedoms offered by the Constitution. The court ruled 6-3, upholding their decision to convict the Japanese. They claimed that Japanese Americans were radio signaling enemy ships from shore and were prone to disloyalty. The court called the incarceration a military necessity. They claimed that although a majority of Japanese were, without a doubt, loyal, there was an uncertain number of those who weren't, and that alone was enough to implement the incarceration of the whole. At no point did they have actual concrete evidence to support their claims. This court case in particular would be reopened many years later. On the very same day of the court ruling for Korematsu versus U.S., ex parte Endo also got a court ruling. A young woman, Mitsue Endo, challenged the court's decision's right to detain their citizens on no legitimate basis, implying there were only undertones of racism. Mitsue Endo got dismissed from her job and was ordered to report to one of the relocation centers. Her lawyer had filed a writ of habeas corpus on her behalf. According to the Center for Constitutional Rights, habeas corpus, or the Great Writ, is a legal procedure that keeps the government from holding you indefinitely without showing cause. The court had stated, first, we are of view that Mitsue Endo should be given her liberty. And reaching that conclusion, we do not come to the underlying constitutional issues which have been argued. For we conclude that whatever power the War Relocation Authority may have to detain other classes of citizens has no authority to subject citizens who are conceitedly loyal to its leader. They unanimously agreed that they had no right to detain citizens who have shown loyalty, in spite of ruling the same day that the Japanese were, without a doubt, loyal, but the presence of those who weren't posed a threat. Even though the Japanese were released, ex parte Endo refused to rule on if Executive Order 9066 was constitutional or not. They argued that they would not touch upon the basis, since they had concluded that as long as citizens were loyal, they had no right to detain them. Ex parte Endo resulted in the shutdown of the internment camps. Their internees were free to resume their life, whatever slither that had remained alive outside of the camp they stayed at. The result of ex parte Endo left things unanswered. The court's decision not to speak on the constitutionality of the order illustrates how unapologetic they were. They wouldn't admit they're wrong, not then, and not for a very long time. That was in 1944. In 1983, the court case Korematsu versus U.S. was reopened. It was discovered that important information had been deliberately withheld. J. Edgar Hoover of the FBI, the SEC, the Office of Naval Intelligence, and other authoritative intelligence agencies categorically denied that the Japanese Americans had committed any wrongdoing. These official reports were never presented to the U.S. Supreme Court, having been intentionally suppressed and, in one case, destroyed by setting the report afire, according to the Korematsu Institute. Upon finding out this information, the U.S. justice lawyers offered a pardon to Korematsu on the condition that the court case would not be reopened, but it was gladly denied. This reopening resulted in an overturning of the court decision back in 1944. Korematsu continued his life with activism. He helped pass a bill for $20,000 compensation for each surviving Japanese American that faced incarceration. Even though they waited a long time for the world to turn back and apologize, and even though they were well aware of the rights the Constitution had guaranteed them, they were not protected. The government, of all things, had done that, and their loyalty, of all things, were questioned and used as a basis for their incarceration, as a basis for their oppression. But they fought and they waited. Even if it would be many years later, they finally got an apology. All in all, this event in particular showed how there was conflict but compromise could not be achieved. Of all things, their loyalty was questioned and used as a basis for their oppression. In that, we see how behind the barbed wire into the courts, they fought.